today on the show. Today we have a special guest, Tony Turner, the Turner, as in Cohen, Pollock, Merlin Turner here at our firm. Tony, it's so nice to see you today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Tony is the best of the best, and I'm really excited to sit with him today and have him answer a few of our questions. Tony, let's just get started with something easy. You know, when people come in and they talk to us about planning, what is the first question you hear often?
Oh, gosh. Most people are really concerned about what happens when they die, and so that's the very first question is, if I don't have a will, what happens if I die? Because they don't have a will. That's why they're here to see us.
Yeah, well, and I find that some of those initial conversations end up being, for me, helpful to push people towards goal-oriented conversations. Do you use anything like that? How do you help make people feel comfortable in what can usually sometimes be an intimidating conversation?
Yeah, well, you try to interject a little bit of humor.
Yeah.
Take it into third person, so we're not talking about you're dying. We're talking about if someone died, here's what we would do. And usually, we talk about the family situation, who are their children, what are the issues in the family, how do they feel about certain things, like if your spouse remarried, what would you want to have happen if you had predeceased them? So you try to loosen it up and talk about hypotheticals.
Yeah, well, and speaking of making humor, I mean, I think my favorite way to do it is to marry spouses off to interesting folks. So if you're John Travolta's next wife, like, what's your next step? You know, how do you feel about that? Who gets the money?
And sometimes they answer and stars up all kinds of I had a client say, well, she's left-handed, so it's created a whole issue that we didn't have.
Well, okay, so when we're kind of having those initial conversations and someone calls and they say, I have zero planning, what's the next step for them?
Well, first we explain kind of what you need. There's a number of documents that every client needs. Obviously a will, but we also deal with things for incapacity like powers of attorney and medical directives. So we walk you through everything that you really need to have in order to cover all the bases.
Well, so Tony, we know we need a will. We've talked a little bit about powers of attorney, but when people come in, they want to know, what's a trust? What kind of trusts are they? Can you tell me a little bit about basic trust planning?
Sure. So most people have a will that leaves assets to somebody, and when they leave them to a person, they usually want to leave it to them outright, meaning when the person dies, that person who's their beneficiary receives those assets in their own name. But every now and then there are reasons you want to put restrictions on what somebody can do. The obvious is if you've got young children, you're not going to turn over your assets to little children, so you need to keep them in a place where they can be managed for the benefit of those children until they grow up. That's what a trust is, virtually just a bank account or a brokerage account that holds those assets for the benefit of those little children until they grow up. And that's all a trust really is.
Well, how do we make sure that my kids have what they need if the money's in a trust?
Well, there's someone in charge of the trust called the trustee. Usually it's a family member or a friend. And that person is directed by the trust instrument, which is just a provision in the will, to use that money for the benefit of the children, to pay for their support, their education, their medical care. A lot of times people struggle with who should be the trustee, because they're worried that that person may not either fulfill the obligation or understand what they're supposed to do or how to manage the trust. So a lot of time we spend just trying to identify who do they trust with their children's inheritance.
Well, that brings, talking about managing things, when we have a will, I also have people who struggle with a similar decision on who to be the executor, who's going to help probate my estate.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. So there's a lot of jobs that you have to identify in an estate plan. Executor is the person who settles the estate, meaning they gather all the assets, determine what the liabilities are, pay all those expenses and taxes, and then they're directed at that point to turn over the assets to the trustee. A lot of times the executor and the trustee are the same person. People struggle with identifying who that should be. Typically it's a family member. If you have, parents who are relatively young, they might be an example of who could do it. If your parents are older, it might be your siblings.
Well, what if I don't trust my siblings?
Well, there's a lot of that going around. So some people have good friends that they would choose to do this, but a lot of people don't have anybody that they trust or that really can do the job, and so there are other options. Corporate trustees and corporate executors. Banks and financial institutions have whole departments of people who do this for a living. They obviously charge to do it, but they're professionals. So that's a great solution for somebody who doesn't have anybody that they trust to be the trustee.
Well, that's really nice. It's nice that you can take a financial institution or a financial person that you already have a relationship with and incorporate them into your planning so that I don't have to worry about, what my sister's second cousin's brother is doing with my money.
Exactly. And some people do both. They'll pick a person that they can identify that has an inkling of what that family would want their children, for example, to be able to do and not do. But they don't want that person to be solely responsible for the estate. So they'll have a co-trustee, Aunt Susie and the bank as co-trustees, so that they know it's professionally managed, but they also know that there's somebody that knows the kids, knows the family. And so we use that a lot in those situations where they don't trust one individual to do it. They pair them with a corporate trustee.
Well, that makes sense. It's kind of the best of both worlds. Well, and we're talking about documents you need after you pass away. I think that people don't often think about the documents they need while they're still living, which are arguably some of the most important documents that we draft. And you mentioned it a little before, powers of attorney, advance directives, and financial powers of attorney. When I'm picking somebody to be what we call the agent, what should I look for?
Yeah, so it depends on which type of document it is. If it's an advance directive for healthcare, which is the form we use in Georgia to deal with medical decision, you need to think about who do you trust with your life, so to speak. I mean, this person is in charge of any medical decision that might come up during your illness where you're unable to make decisions for yourself, including termination of life support. And that's a tricky one for some people. Again, usually it's a family member or friend. If you're married, your spouse is usually your first choice. Oftentimes, if you're going to the second tier, your backup to your spouse, one spouse will name somebody on their side of the family to be their backup, and the other spouse will name somebody on their side of the family. And reason is that that's such a personal issue. Who would want to have to make a decision about end of life for your brother-in-law?
Mm-hmm.
It probably would be better that somebody on their own side of the family were making those decisions. And sometimes we'll have a committee. It might be one person who can make routine decisions, but if it comes to end of life decision, maybe there's more than one, just because they want some sort of consensus. But that's a really tough job, and a lot of people struggle with who would they make responsible for those types of really important decisions. The other side of the coin is the financial power of attorney. And that document is really just about who do you trust with your checkbook. If you're in a car wreck and you end up in the hospital, you've chosen one person to make medical decisions, but you need to think about, well, who's going to pay all my bills while I'm incapacitated? And that's the job of the agent under the power of attorney. And that's usually a different personality. It's a different kind of job. And so I have clients all the time who'll pick one person to make healthcare decisions they believe has a soft heart and best interests in mind there, but they trust somebody a little more clinical on the financial side. And you can mix and match, and you can have co-agents, although my suggestion is not to do that because it takes 2 signatures for every check if you have a co-agent.
Right.
And if you have co-agents on the medical, both people have to be present to make routine medical decisions. That can be messy. Doesn't really need a committee to decide if you get orange Jell-O or green Jell-O that day. So,
Well, something else we also address in our financial powers of attorney documents that people ask me about is guardianship. I mean, I always use my big Britney Spears example, right? But what's the difference between a guardian and a power of attorney, like an agent who is your power of attorney?
right. So guardianship really involves 2 things. One is guardianship over your person. So if you don't have a medical directive, for example, and you end up in the hospital, the only way a family can get involved in making decisions for you about your health care is to go to court and have you declared incompetent by a court, and then the court will appoint that family member as a guardian who can then make those health care decisions for you. That's a tremendous amount of effort, and it's difficult to get someone declared incompetent. So that's why we have medical directives, to avoid guardianship. The other side of the coin relates to the power of attorney. So if you don't have a power of attorney, well, then who can pay your bills? Well, in Georgia, you can have someone declared incompetent, and they appoint someone called a conservator who can then handle the financial side of things. So these 2 documents are so important because they avoid having to go to court and be declared incompetent to appoint either a guardian or a conservatorship. Those things going through a court are difficult to obtain. Lots and lots of court supervision about that person's actions, and it's just expensive. So it's critical that everybody have the medical directive and power of attorney to avoid guardianship and conservatorship.
Right. And I think a great example is early in my career, I had someone come in and ask me the heartbreaking question of, both of my parents have reached that point and can no longer make decisions for themselves. I need to make powers of attorney for them. And you have to look at those people and say, it's too late. Mm-hmm. Those documents need to be executed before that time, which is why planning is so important.
Yeah. We run into that all the time with dementia and Alzheimer's, and then you really are forced into the court system. So everybody should have these documents.
Tony, so I know a lot of our clients are business owners. We love business owners.
Yeah,
it's so much fun to work with, especially people who own family-owned businesses. What are some things some business owners should think about in terms of estate planning specifically?
Yeah, so one thing is we've been talking about is incapacity. Without a power of attorney, as we've been talking about, nobody can take any action for you financially. Well, if you've got an active business and everything screeches to a halt, that can destroy the business. There's nobody there to make payroll checks. There's nobody there to make decisions about active business decisions. And so we often will do a separate power of attorney just for the business side of things, because who you trust with your checkbook and your personal affairs might be different than who you would want managing the business. Often the power of attorney is actually somebody who's a key employee at the business who can carry on in the event of the owner's incapacity. And the flip side of the coin is when that person dies, business succession is really important. If you don't have a plan, you don't have a will that directs what happens to the business. I had a scenario where the client had no will. He was married and had 2 children who were minors. He passed away unexpectedly, and under Georgia law, as you know, without a will, the spouse doesn't get everything. In fact, in this case, the children got 2/3 of the estate automatically, and 1/3 went to the spouse, and that included the business. So imagine now you have a business that's owned 1/3 by a spouse, 2/3 by children. The court appoints a guardian for those children to reflect their interests in the business. And imagine trying to run a business with a court-appointed guardian owning 2/3 of the business and 1/3 owned by the widow. It was an utter disaster.
That's hard. I've had a similar situation where I had what was then a single mother, lost her husband and had a minor son, and she owned a cleaning business, a services-based business, and all of a sudden her son, her 8-year-old son, now owns half of her business. It created a nightmare, and there were also creditors involved. I think, just a little bit of planning. These conversations are so hard to have, but with a little bit of planning, it can really help manage chaos in what can be a already difficult situation.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming, Tony, and joining us today. Thank you so much for watching. We are so thrilled to have you. And if you'd like to hear more from either Tony or I, or you'd like to talk to any of the attorneys at our office, you can make an appointment and see more info about us at our website, www.cpmtlaw.com. Please also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn.